All right, welcome everybody. Thank you for joining us this afternoon for the Champlain Valley Petal Fall meeting. I'm Mike Basedow, and I am the Tree Fruit Specialist here in the Champlain Valley. A quick housekeeping before we get started with the presentations, with the content. If it's been a little while since you've been on Zoom, just a quick reminder for this meeting. As Terence is going through his slides, we ask that you please keep your camera off and that you keep your microphone muted. To do that, you can hover down near the bottom of your screen, and this toolbar should pop up. You just want to make sure that you're muted and that your video is off. Once Terence is done with his presentation, you're welcome to unmute yourself and ask questions directly. That should be no problem. We got a small crowd here today, so I think we'll have ample opportunity to do that and ask specific questions. As he is going through, if you think of a question and you want to make sure we get it answered, you can pull up the chat box. That's going to be that little chat icon near the bottom. Just click on that and you can type in your questions, and we'll make sure we answer them as we're going through the presentation today. Another bit of housekeeping. I'd like to thank Valent for sponsoring our thinning meetings this season. We greatly appreciate the support. And if you're going to be joining us in person for our fruit set meeting that we're going to be holding in Peru, likely at the end of next week, we're also going to have Jim Wargo here, who's going to be discussing their new thinning product, Exceed, which is going to be a good material for thinning at the 18 millimeter fruit stage, so sort of that later thinning. So we're excited to have him up here to hear more about that. I'm also doing a few trials with Exceed in the Champlain Valley this year, so hoping to get good local data with that product this season. So now I want to just talk about some of my observations in the Champlain Valley as I was going around the last couple of days and earlier this afternoon. So from today, it looks like max are just about petal fall in Peru. I'd say we probably had most petals off yesterday into today with the wind that's been picking up. There's still bloom out on some of our later varieties, though. We don't see that super wide stretching phenology that we've been seeing in other parts of New York, like the Hudson Valley and the Capital Region, but certainly those later varieties are still a couple days behind our max. Looking at king fruit size, I'd say we're pretty much running between 3 to 5 millimeters today. Max are more in that 4 to 5 range. Everything else I've been looking at has been more in that 3 to 4 range. So we can see that difference in range, not only in the phenology, but in the fruit size as well. So it looks like our thinning windows might be a few days behind with those later varieties. Looking at Honeycrisp more closely, just looking at the return bloom there, I've really been impressed in the Champlain Valley with the amount of return bloom I'm seeing in our Honeycrisp, despite having a really heavy crop load and a lot of blocks last year. Really, they seem to have bloomed very nicely this year, really across the board. There were a few blocks here and there that might be a little bit lighter, but overall, I was really happy to see the amount of bloom that we had in our Honeycrisp this year. Looking at some kings across the board, looking for any winter damage. I did see a little bit here and there, but it was really just in a few isolated blocks, mostly in Honeycrisp and low-lying spots. And I would say the damage that I saw was very minor. Definitely below 5%, just in a couple of clusters here and there. So it seemed overall that the damage I was seeing was very light. And a little bit more on that damage that I was seeing, just to turn my pointer on here, I think a lot of this damage likely occurred during the midwinter, probably in that early February stretch where we had temperatures in the 40s and 50s, and then 2 days later we had that minus 20 degree right at the beginning of February. And we can see, looking at some of these photos here, the type of damage I'm seeing. You can see here, that king really never grew. Similarly down here, the kings are just small. They never really formed. They never opened up. So I think that's why it's more of that really early winter damage that we're seeing on some of these blocks. And that being said, when we look at overall our pollination weather, overall, again, unlike some of the other regions in the state, we had a really good set of days where I thought pollination was really going to be great from the weather. We had some warm, sunny days. I saw a lot of bees flying last week when things opened up, and really it didn't get cool and rainy again until the last couple of days. So overall, while it's still too early to tell, I anticipate that we had really nice pollination. I think we're going to have really nice set. So hopefully we've got really good conditions moving forward. So with that, I'm going to stop sharing my screen and turn things over to Dr. Robinson.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's a pleasure to be back with you today and talk a little bit about what we should be doing for thinning in the next week. I think Mike's expecting to hold an in-person meeting up there when we get ready for the normal 10 to 12 millimeter spray, and I expect to come this year in contrast to the last few years, but we'll do this one again by Zoom. I want to just remind you that we're pushing and encouraging growers to think about thinning in a multi-spray program with sequential sprays starting at Bloon with thinning sprays of ATS or a hormone type thinner like NAA, followed by the thinning spray we're looking at right now, which is the Petal fall spray, which generally goes on when fruits are 5 to 6 millimeters, and we've been able to time that using degree days, somewhere between 100 and 130 degree days after bloom. That's all we're going to talk about right now. I'll have a few comments at the very end, how you should consider using the fruit growth rate model to really look at what's happened so far if you thinned at bloom and at petal fall. My assessment of the current situation is a little bit of a repeat of some of the things that Mike said, but I wanted to mention that I thought green tip was about normal time. It seemed like it would come really early. We had those hot temperatures, right, that push green tip forward. But ever since 1/4 inch green, we've had cool temperatures. And that's generally slowed down bloom development so that the time between green tip and bloom was at least a month. Full bloom, Mike tells me, was on Max. He would have said May 11th, on Gala's, Honeycrisp, Snapdragons, May 14th. And I'm sure that the Shazy folks are behind in these dates. There is a small amount of winter damage that Mike has pointed out to me, and I'm not too worried about it, and I'll tell you why as we go through this. It's very good that we've had good bee activity and we've had no frost to date, but the forecasted temperatures tonight and the next night are concerning. And so I'll put that into my comments as we go through how you should consider adjusting what you might do thinning in consideration of the frost that might happen. Now, I hope it doesn't happen, but it might. Now, many of you, I hope, considered caustic thinners at Bloon. We really only have one that's labeled, and that's ATS. And so when I run the pollen tube growth model using the bloom dates that Mike gave me, you should have sprayed your first spray somewhere around the 12th of May, or started the model on the 12th of May, sorry, with the first spray on the 14th of May. And the second spray should go on today or yesterday. So the cool temperatures show that the model didn't continue its upward trajectory very much because it's cooled down today and then tomorrow's to be cool, but it still has reached essentially 100%. And so hopefully if you decided to use caustic thinners on bloom sprays on Honeycrisp particularly, you've gotten them on already. Now, for those of you who didn't want to do that and would still like to try to use one of the hormone thinners at the bloom timing, there's still some time, a couple of days, to possibly put either NAA on Honeycrisp or NAD. They're both very mild and safe at bloom. They can be sprayed at relatively high rates, at 4 ounces on NAA or 8 ounces per 100 on NAD. But we've shown repeatedly that they do improve return bloom on Honeycrisp, as well as the ATS caustic thinner. It also improves return bloom. So if you're going to you haven't put on ATS and you want to consider a hormone thinner, wait till tomorrow, wait till after the frost, and then you could go out with either 4 ounces of NAA or 8 to 10 ounces of NAD per 100 gallons. I'm not going to say anything more about bloom thinning because that is a topic for the previous meeting, and today we're here to talk about the petal fall timing. One of the things that really helps me in trying to see how we're coming in this weather is to run the carbohydrate model. And this is for Peru. And you can see that green tip was in April. I think it was April 14th or something like that I put in. There was hot weather right after green tip, and that's what gave these fairly substantial negative carbohydrate balances. The blue line is 0. So we've been negative, below 0 in carbohydrate balance ever since green tip. And just very recently, we got up to today would be, or a full bloom on the 14th. I put in a full bloom date for Gala or Honeycrisp of the 14th. Would be the first day of a positive carbohydrate balance. Now, the cool weather that we're experiencing today and tomorrow gives us a carbohydrate surplus. And so as we now approach the petal fall window, I put this blue box on the chart, but it probably should be moved to the right because we're not even in that box yet. The carbohydrate model only predicts 2 days forward. And we'll probably be beyond that before anybody should be spraying a petal fall spray for thinning. So 2 points that come to mind from this data so far is that we've had this very long period between green tip and full bloom of negative carbohydrate balance. I'm not too worried about it. That's typical. And then secondly, that we had this just a mild carbohydrate deficit at pink and early bloom, which were these 2 points here right before full bloom. Now, the other part of the carbohydrate balance that I like to look at is the table showing temperatures in the first 2 columns, solar radiation. And for that, I'll just pause and tell you that a very sunny day is 24 to 28. A very cloudy day is below 10 megajoules per square meter. And so we look at that on how it impacts the carbohydrate balance. And you can see that the carbohydrate balance beginning at bloom, which I put in here on May 14th, it starts to color the cells a particular color. And the key is up here at the top. If you thin during any of those days so far, you would expect very mild thinning. Because we have not had serious carbohydrate deficits so far in the thinning period. The second thing I look at is in this next to the last column are the accumulated degree days. Now, we prefer that you wait to put on your petal fall spray till you get to 100. And so let's look at where we're at. If we had a full bloom on Honeycrisp or Gala on the 14th, and today we're the 17th, because of cool weather, we've only gotten around 29 degree days. And as we move forward with cool weather, it goes up pretty slow. So even by the 22nd, which is as far as this model will predict forward, we're still only at 78 degree days, which means that it won't be probably until May 23rd that we'll get to the 100 for Honeycrisp and for Gala. Now for Max, I ran that model, but I didn't put it in the slides. It shows that we will reach that accumulated degree days a day earlier on the 22nd. So let's just try to pull this all together in what we would suggest for petal fall sprays. All indications are you had good bloom and good pollination, but the reality is it's still too early to assess fruit set in the Champlain Valley. That's what I want to look at, particularly when we come up there, maybe the end of next week for the in-person thinning meeting, is really what we can see by looking at the trees and the fruit set. This year, we're predicted through this petal fall period to have temperatures that are relatively low, some in the low 60s, some in the mid 60s, and then 1 or 2 days in the low 70s. So in contrast to the previous couple of years where we had heat waves around this time, this year it's going to be cool. That means that there's little chance of over-thinning at petal fall this year. Nevertheless, I still feel that a petal fall spray with some thinner in it is an essential component of any thinning program. Most commonly, we would suggest a full dose of either NA and 7, or interestingly, NAD has performed very well in trials in recent years and has had a big comeback. It's also very safe. So NAD and 7 also would be equally as good in blocks with strong set. But expect only mild thinning from it this year. Now, with the temperatures this year in the 60s and possibly in the low 70s, Maxellin 7 won't work as well as if it was 80 degrees, but it still works. So I particularly like that for galas, and especially when you're in the Champlain Valley and fruit size of gala is naturally going to be smaller because it's a shorter, cooler growing season. I would definitely use Maxellin 7 on gala, even at starting at petal fall, then again at the 12 millimeters. I want to emphasize, don't spray your petal fall spray too soon. We did this study where we tested it for 17 years, and when we spray, when we can blow the petals off, when they're only 4 millimeters, we just don't get much response. You have to let them grow a millimeter or two before you can get much response out of the thinners. Now, that's a little bit in contrast with what people are worried about with plum curculio and want to get in there as soon as possible. But nevertheless, for thinning, I think if you can wait a little bit till the kings get closer to 6 and the laterals are closer to 5 before putting on your petal fall thinning spray, you get better response. The easiest way to do it is just to use the degree day calculator that's in the carbohydrate model, log on to the NUA website or the MaluSim app on your phone, and wait to spray the thinners until you get to the 100 to 125. And as I indicated, that's going to be probably May 23rd. That's at least what it looks like to me now. I really encourage you to use a carbohydrate model to look at that degree days and to adjust how aggressive you want to be with your thinning and exactly when. I remind you that there is a web-based version at the Cornell NUA weather site, but we also have developed a mobile phone version that you can download for free from the Apple Store or the Android Store. There's a new version of MaluSim at these Apple Store or Android Store that we just put up last week. So if you have that on your phone from last year, delete it and download a new version today. The MaluSim version, which also has a fruit growth rate model I'll talk about in a minute, also has a desktop version if you want to use it from your office on your computer. And that's located at malusim.org. I have that caution in there under that the second bulleted point that don't spray if carbohydrate deficits are severe. That means less than minus 60 grams. It's really not expected this year at all. My purpose in talking about this so aggressively today is I want to encourage you to have confidence that you won't overthin, but that you have got to do something at petal fall, especially with a really good bloom and a great bloom on Honeycrisp. So it'll only have a moderate effect, but that on the other side of the coin, that means it's very safe. I have two suggested fruit thinning protocols for Honeycrisp and Gala. I didn't put one in for Mac because it's much simpler. With NA and 7, we can generally do a really good job. But these two difficult varieties, I think, require a blossom spray. And in this case, I like for Honeycrisp ATS. But I would add, if you did not use ATS or were afraid to, you can still put on an NA spray today, or not tonight because of the frost, but tomorrow. This should be followed by the petal fall spray at the 5 to 6 millimeters with a full dose of NA. Now that's a 10 part per million, what we used to call 10 part per million, and some people are afraid of it. But a petal fall 10 parts per million is very safe. So 4 ounces per 100 and a pint of 7 per 100 is what I would suggest for Honeycrisp when we get into next week. On the 23rd is when I'm expecting that should be sprayed. That should be followed about a week later by the regular thinning spray with a slightly lower dose of NA, because fruits are much more sensitive when they get 10, 11, 12 millimeters. So there we suggest a 3 ounce rate, and then hopefully you're done. But if they didn't work because we don't have any carbohydrate deficits to help, then you would come back when fruits are 16, 17 millimeters. In the past, we've liked Maxell 7 and oil, but the new combination of Exceed, the new thinner from Valent, which is ACC, combined with some Maxell has worked quite well for us for Honeycrisp. For Gala, a slightly different set of recommendations. I like NAA at Bloom or Amethyst at Bloom for Gala, but following that, the Petal Fall and the regular 10 to 12 millimeters, and even later, a Maxell-based program gives us the best fruit size. So what are my suggestions for you to consider this year? I think that the best timing based on degree days would be the earliest would be Saturday, May 20th through Wednesday of May 24th, with most likely the May 23rd for Honeycrisp and Gala. Now, Max are more close to Petal Fall, and so they could be sprayed as early as this Saturday. I suggest you use full rates of NAA or Maxell and 7 with Gala. Now, the rates I have listed either on the previous slide or on this slide are all based on dilute tree roll volume. And I want to just go over this again to make sure we're on the same page of how you're going to mix up a tank. It's important for the thinning spray, and maybe more important than any other spray you do during the year, is to calculate the tree roll volume of that orchard, and then calculate what we call the concentration factor. That is the tree roll volume divided by the volume that you end up spraying per acre. That's the concentration factor. So I give an example. Let's suppose, and this is kind of the case, a mature tall spindle orchard often will measure out with a 200-gallon tree roll volume. So that's pretty typical on mature orchards. Let's suppose that you're only spraying 100 since you don't want to haul so much water. So 200 divided by 100 gives you a concentration factor of 2. That concentration factor has to be considered when you mix up each spray tank. So let's use the example of a 3-ounce rate of NAA. I gave 3 ounces per 100 on a dilute basis. So that means we have to multiply that by 2, since instead of spraying 200 gallons, we're only spraying 100. So that gives 6 ounces of NAA in every 100 gallons in the sprayer. And our sprayer holds 500 gallons. That means we're going to put a total of 30 ounces of NAA in the spray tank. That's a critical calculation that if you do it wrong, or you could underspray considerably, you do it wrong the other way, you could overspray. So just take the time to do this calculation. Now, lastly, let me comment that for 7 carbaryl or surfactants, I don't generally use a concentration factor. With 7, it's because only 1 pint per 100 is soluble. If you put in the double amount with a concentration factor of 2 pints per 100, then the second pint is just being mixed around and it's sprayed out and deposited on the leaf. It sits there, does no thinning unless it's re-wetted. If it's re-wetted, then we get more thinning. And that unknown variability is what I don't like. Now, some people rely on that, so I understand if you choose to use the concentration factor for 7. I'll talk about surfactants in just a minute. I think it's important as you spray next week is when I really think you should be spraying, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday. Even for Max, I probably was wait to spray Monday, but assess each block. If you see what Mike was seeing, some kings missing, but most are present, use full rates. But if more than half or most of the kings are missing, then you might be more conservative. But I still hope you will spray something because you'll have a full crop with the laterals. Wait until you get to at least 100 degree days before you put on this petal fall spray, and just plug your date of bloom into the carbohydrate model and it will automatically calculate it for you. I want to suggest again, like we did last year, that I like to nozzle the sprayer slightly differently. For bloom, especially the caustic sprays, I'd like to have a uniform nozzle output from the top of the to the bottom of the bank. That's because the ATS has to land on each flower's pistil. But for hormone type sprays, especially starting at petal fall, I like to nozzle them with most of the spray going to the top half of the tree, 2/3 of it in the top, and only 1/3 in the bottom. Now, as we get further down the road to the 12 millimeter spray, then I like to put even less in the bottom, because if you spray the petal fall spray with that 2/3 top, 1/3 bottom nozzling arrangement, you'll thin the bottoms pretty good. And then you only need a little more in the bottoms when you get to the 12 millimeter. But if we put a lot of spray in the bottoms at the 12 millimeter, we'll over thin it. Now, a few comments about surfactants like Regulate. It is proven, and I've got a number of years of data showing that regulated added to NAA will increase the response by about 50%. I've always sort of been hesitant to recommend Regulate in the East because it's so variable. But more recently, with the carbohydrate model, I've become more enthused about suggesting these two rules. If you have a situation where there's no deficit and what you have is a surplus of carbohydrates, it's very difficult to get thinning. And in that case, some Regulate, 1 pint per 100, will improve the performance of NAA. But if you have a carbohydrate deficit, then I think it is risky and will potentially cause over-thinning. So with those two rules, I would like to encourage you to consider either adding some Regulate to the tank or not. This is why I suggest that the day you spray, you run the carbohydrate model that day. It takes just seconds, and just see where you're at. If your 6-day estimated carbohydrate balance is positive, it's above 0, add some Regulate. If it's not, don't add. If it's negative, don't add any Regulate. Now, let's suppose that you take my advice and you spray a petal fall spray either Monday or Tuesday or Wednesday of next week, depending on whether it's Max or whether it's Gala or Honeycrisp or Snapdragon or other varieties. How do you know what you achieved? Well, this is where the fruit growth rate model really is helpful. Typically, with the historical way we've done the fruit growth rate model for at least the last 7 to 8 years, is to tag fruits, clusters, measure them about 50-degree days after we put on that petal fall application. So let's suppose you sprayed Monday. 50-degree days would probably be about 3 days, but it depends on whether it's cool or hot. So you'd wait 50-degree days, then measure your fruits the first time, then wait another 70-degree days, getting to 120 total after that application, measure again. You enter the data in the MaluSim app, and you get the answer immediately on how many fruits you've thinned off. Now, I would say you can download this new version of MaluSim from malusim.org, or no, from the Apple Store or the Android Store, or you can use it on a desktop at malusim.org. Now, I offer my help if any of you have trouble using the fruit growth rate model and you go to all the trouble to measure fruits and you just can't seem to get it to work for you, or you worry about the data right or wrong. Send me the data and I'll look at it and interpret it with you to give you further suggestions. Now, I do want to add that there are 2 other methods of using the fruit growth rate model. I have it listed here in the second bulleted point. One of them we credit Todd Einhorn from Michigan, and it's a fruit size distribution model, FSDM, in which you don't measure diameters. You just go out and collect 100 fruits off of all the fruits on a spur until you get 100 fruits, bring them back to your office, weigh them on a little scale, put in the individual fruit weights into their program. And if you do that twice, 3 days after spraying and 7 days after spraying, it will tell you. You do have to pick the fruits and you do have to weigh them individually, so it still is a little bit of an effort. There's some more exciting ways of doing this with cameras, digital cameras and cell phones. There are 2 companies that are doing this. One is Pomida, and Mike is working with us on this project, and he has a camera, and so we'll probably demonstrate this when we come up for the in-person meeting late next week sometime. But you simply take a video of several trees, and you do that 3 days after spraying, and then 7 days after spraying, upload that video to their website, and they will identify the fruits, measure how much they grew, and give you back an answer. There's a second company called Orchard Robotics. I don't think any of you there have worked with them yet. We're working with them here at Geneva, which also gives us an opportunity to use digital cameras to estimate how many fruits are going to fall off. I'm pretty excited about this because I think as we move forward, you'll all be using one of these digital tools to figure out how much thinning you got after the petal fall spray. You can reuse the same technology after the 12 millimeter spray to figure out whether you've done a decent job or you need to come back with a rescue spray. I won't go over this slide very much, just as the way that we typically do it using calipers. You count the total number of clusters on 5 trees, you tag 15 spurs on 5 trees, and then you measured the diameter of every fruit in the cluster 50 days after application, then remeasure 50-degree days, and remeasure after 100-degree days, and then enter that data on the phone, either in MaluSim or on the computer at malusim.org. The MaluSim phone app has voice recognition, so you can measure and then just say the number and it'll record it. What I like about this fruit growth rate model is it gives you this kind of data. This is a slide from last year with a Fuji block that, if you look at the graph, it shows that there's an upper pink little bar that shows, based on the number of flower clusters we counted on the trees, they had about 550 potential fruits per tree. The grower had set the target to be 120 fruits per tree and then applied the petal fall spray. And it shows this blue bar that they had reduced the number of fruits from 550 that they started with down to 226. He still had 100 more fruits than he wanted for his final fruit number, but that gives him a sense of how much thinning he has left. And so we recommended that he go ahead and apply a 12 millimeter spray to get down closer to the 120 target number. I want to end with this little chart. I've shown it a couple of times, but we're much more focused on following this exactly for Honeycrisp. It's a series of 7 sprays aimed at thinning first and then enhancing flower bud formation for next year. It starts with ATS at full bloom, and actually there's 2 sprays there, so I guess it's 8 total sprays, timed with a pollen tube growth model. That's followed by what you're going to do this coming week with NAA and 7 at petal fall. And then that's followed by the traditional spray at 12 millimeters with NAA and 7 again. And you can see down on the little tan bar at the bottom the number of days after bloom. So if full bloom on Honeycrisp was the 14th, then the 21st would be 7 days later. That's about when we're saying you should spray your petal fall spray. And then another 7 days is when you'll be spraying the 12 millimeter and so forth. But once you get to about 3 weeks out from bloom and fruits are approaching 16, 17 millimeters, we suggest you start with a series of 4 ethereal sprays. The first one is at a half dose, a half pint per acre. The second one is at a full dose a week later. By this time, fruits are up at the 22 to 25 millimeter, and they're not sensitive for thinning. But this ethereal at the full dose of 1 pint influences return bloom, another ethereal a week later, and another ethereal a week later. So that the last ethereal is about 42 days after bloom, which is going to take you about to the end of June. Now, we did this interesting study this past year where we compared this strategy versus starting the NAA or ethereal sprays the last week of June, which is what we've traditionally recommended. Starting in late June didn't work, but starting ethereal sprays at the 16, 17 millimeter did work in terms of inducing return bloom on Honeycrisp. So if you've got a really great bloom with Honeycrisp, you really should consider this series of sprays to both thin and then enhance flower formation. So with that, I'm going to end my presentation and be happy to discuss this further or answer any questions. But thank you for your attention.
All right, thank you, Terence. So with that, I'd like to go ahead and open things up for questions. You can type them in the question box, or you're welcome to also unmute yourself and ask directly.
And I would invite you, Mike, to just add any comments you want to add on things you see in there with your own eyes, since I haven't been there yet.
Certainly, yeah. One question I had, Terence, and you mentioned it already. We do have a frost advisory for tomorrow morning. Depending on where we're at in the Champlain Valley, I've seen predictions for lows of anywhere from 31, and as you get further away from the lake, further south, down to 27. So with that in mind, how do you think these cold temperatures might impact these petal fall thinners and our overall thinning windows? Do you expect the trees to thin a little bit more easily based on those cold temperatures?
Well, that's a difficult question. Probably yes. But let me give you some of the thinking that is behind that. So we're talking about Wednesday night, Thursday morning frost. I'm suggesting these thinners go on for max Monday and for Honeycrisp and Gala Tuesday, Wednesday. There's enough time between those sprays that it may not greatly increase the thinning. Now, it is possible, and I relish even mentioning this, but those temperatures, if they truly materialize, will cause problems. We'll see frost ring on apples, and unfortunately, you would hope you could thin off every fruit that has a frost ring on it, but it turns out they don't thin off, and that's the problem. If it was the day after, yes, I think the thinners, if you were spraying tomorrow morning, it would probably definitely cause excessive thinning. But by next Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, I'm not sure we'll get all the damaged fruit off that we wish we could get off. I want to add one more thing that I didn't think to put in the presentation. We've got good data from a couple of years after heavy frost of spraying Promolin within 24 hours, and it increases the set. Our fruits at this stage in late bloom are 3 to 4 millimeters. They can probably take 30 with no problem, maybe 29. But if we get 27, 26, 25, we'll definitely have damage. And if I were there, I would spray Promolin tomorrow morning to try to keep some of those fruits on. What it does, it attempts to increase the survivability of the ovules inside that fruit so that they will keep growing. If they stop growing, they fall off.
All right, thank you, Terence. We had a question in the chat box from Jesse. We went pretty aggressively on bloom thinning this season and have sprayed 4-ounce dilute rate NAA on many blocks and some ATS as well. Will the potential frost affect the thinning response of that NAA?
So that depends a little bit on when the NAA went on. If it went on this afternoon, then obviously I think it would definitely impact the response of the NAA. But if it went on 2 days ago, then I think it won't have much impact on the frost tomorrow morning.
He said they held off today, mostly 2 and 3 days ago.
So I think you'll be fine, Jesse.
All right, thank you. If anybody has any other questions, please go ahead and type them on in, or feel free to ask directly. One clarification I was hoping you could answer, Terence. When you say to enter the bloom date on the carbohydrate thinning model, that's the full bloom date for each variety?
Yes. And so full bloom has a very specific definition when 80% of the blooms are open on the north side of the tree. So when you look at a cluster, you got to have 4 out of 5 blooms open, even on the north side of the tree, to can be at full bloom. So that's the date we want put into the carbohydrate model. So there's another question. How can we get a copy of the slides? I'm sending Mike the slides as soon as I log off, and he'll figure out a way to make them available.
Yep, I can certainly forward them to anybody who would like them. And we've been recording this meeting, so we'll get the YouTube link out probably the next day.
I've been so happy that this year we haven't had a serious frost problem anywhere in the state. So this is disconcerting to me to get to this point, and then we still have a frost issue coming up.
And looking at the temperatures, I think it's a really borderline situation. So I'm hoping it's not too bad for folks. But certainly it is one that's causing some concern.
Okay.
All right. Well, not seeing any other questions, I think we'll go ahead and call the meeting. Thank you all for joining us, and we will be in touch about the in-person fruit set meeting that we're going to be hosting here in Peru, probably late next week or early the following week. So I'll have a note out on that when we get it scheduled. So thank you, Terence, and thank you everybody for joining us today. We'll see you later.